Hey, it's Sean from the Commander's Brew. As usual, I'm going to walk you through a core of a deck with something cool going on. Feel free to grab it and season to taste. This one's a revisit on one of my favorite decks of all time, Epic Experiment. And we just got the perfect commander for it in the 40k set, Magus Lucea Kane. Let's get right to it after a fake ad from a fake sponsor and one real one. Hey, me again, Darksteel Eric, just reminding you to like and subscribe. It really helps out Darksteel Industries. And now 2 ads, 1 fake, 1 real. Do you have a boring name? Jazz it up with the legal title of Darksteel by buying 1 square centimeter of actual Darksteel Industries headquarters. Go from Robin to Darksteel Robin. Get invited to more parties and grand openings with a title. This title is not the same as ownership, you don't own anything for real, and you can't visit us ever. And now the real ad from the Wizard's Tower. wizardtower.com. Your website for deck techs and other strategic articles. And if you're viewing from Canada, use coupon code BREWUNITED to get 5% off your order of singles when you spend $20 or more. Now that's a party I'd like to be a part of. Now back to the show. This whole deck revolves around Epic Experiment, so let's start there. Epic Experiment. This card is indeed epic. We put a bunch of mana into the X, flip that many cards, and we cast all the instants and sorceries for free as long as their mana value is under how much we put into X. Now look how beautifully this pairs with Magus Lucea Kane. For 4 mana we get a 1/1, and each turn we get to put a +1/+1 counter on someone, but that is not at all why we're here. We want to tap her to add 2 colorless mana for our next X spell. That's 2 towards our Epic Experiment. But this isn't a deck full of X spells. As much as I love X spells. It would be tempting to put a whole bunch of X spells in the deck, but Epic Experiment lets us cast the spells without paying their mana costs. If we flip an X spell this way, X has to equal 0. That's no good. But let me tell you, Lucea Kane working her magic on only this X spell is good enough. Trust me. Did I mention yet that she'll also copy the spell? Imagine, for example, we've got 10 lands on the battlefield. That lets us cast a raw Epic Experiment for X equals 8. But if we have Lucea Kane out, not only do we bump that X up to 10, but we get to do it twice. And here's where the fun begins. If we can untap Lucea Kane and use her ability again, we'll get an additional 2 mana and another copy of the spell. This deck is all about instants and sorceries, and there are no shortage of instants or sorceries that'll untap a creature we control. If we spend 2 mana to untap Lucea Kane, her next tap gives us a rebate on that 2 mana. If we can do it for 1, we're profiting. Cerulean Wisps even draws us a card by doing so. Stony Strength, Burst of Strength, Ornamental Courage, Sudden Spinnerets. You need more? Vitalize and Mobilize untap all your creatures, which includes Lucea Kane. I think it'll be easier to walk you through what this deck is doing with an example. Let's assume we've got 7 lands on the battlefield, plus Lucea and 1 untapped spell in our hand. Lucea gives us 2. We tap 1 of our lands to untap her, putting 2 more in the mana pool. 1 mountain, 1 island starts the Epic Experiment. Lucea counts for 4. We've got 4 more untapped lands, which make X a grand total of 8. Now we've got an Epic Experiment for X equals 8 on the stack, and Lucea puts 2 more copies on. Now we get to look at the next 24 cards and cast all the instants and sorceries that cost 8 or less for free. If we hit any non-instants or sorceries like lands or other permanents, those will end up in the graveyard. We are intending to make a very instant and sorcery heavy deck, so we'll probably get a lot of hits. For the show though, let's assume we hit 8 spells. Every time one of these stacks has an untapper in it, we're going to tap Lucea Kane again, floating 2 more colorless. We're going to get back Epic Experiment and cast it again for more. And we're going to get it back with cards like Regrowth or other things that pull instants or sorceries out of the graveyard. Something I do need to point out though, we've got 3 batches of 8 on the stack. The one on the bottom has the actual Epic Experiment card in it. We've got to pick our targets as we put spells on the stack, so if we draw something like a Regrowth, there isn't an Epic Experiment in the graveyard for us to target. We'll have to target something else like a ramp spell or maybe another untapping spell. And since the one with the real Epic Experiment is on the bottom of the stack, we'll resolve that last. There's still no opportunity to target it if we hit it in any of these first 24 cards. But that's the beauty of a Dryad's Revival or a Mystic Retrieval. If we get either one of these in the first round of Epic Experiments, they'll get us back a ramp spell or an untapped spell, something else, and they'll be sitting here in the graveyard for us to pull back the Epic Experiment. I've mentioned ramp spells a lot. There's a lot of ramp spells in the deck. I guess the real number depends on how brave you're feeling. There's a ton of sorceries that cost a single green that let you search your library for a basic land and put it into your hand. In order to get a higher density of spells, let's run fewer lands. I can come up with 6 single G spells that tutor up a basic into our hand. 7 if you include Renegade Map. Renegade Map isn't actually an instant or sorcery, and if we play it on turn 1, we don't put a land in our hand right now, but we get to use it in the first opportunity we don't have another land to play, so we'll always be making land drops. It's almost the same. And for each one of these, we could go down a forest. So as long as we can reliably get a single forest and one of these G search up a land spells in our opening hand, we can keep things pretty lean. You do get a free mulligan in a multiplayer game of Commander. How brave are you? And of course, we've got a whole bunch of 2-mana ramp spells and some 3-mana ramp spells that mostly put lands directly into play. We just need enough forests to get that ball rolling. So now we can probably assume we'll hit 1 or 2 of these in each stack of Epic Experiment as well. And if I'm putting a bunch of lands into my hand while I resolve these things, I want to do something with them. That's where we're going to run a family of cards that lets us discard a card to draw some more cards. Thrill of Possibility is a classic, and I do like Cathartic Reunion for the ability to discard 2 land cards to draw 3. I want to highlight Mana Severance. If you feel like running it, I wouldn't recommend pulling every single land out of the deck. We'll probably want to leave in a few basics so that we can actually do something when we search things up. I don't want to discard good cards to Thrill a Possibility, but if you do hit it in the first stack of Epic Experiments you're resolving, it will basically ensure that the ones behind it will be wall-to-wall spells. So we're untapping Lucea Kane a bit more, looking at a future Epic Experiment to be copied multiple times. Hopefully we've got a recursion spell in the graveyard with flashback so we can get that Epic Experiment, but we do need more mana. We're tapping out to cast these first batches of Epic Experiment, right? Right, so instead of a Thrill of Possibility, let's upgrade them to things like Big Score or Unexpected Windfall. Pirate's Pillage, Seize the Spoils. These are basically the same spell, but they give us treasures back. Probably want to throw a Prismari Command in there. While we're on treasures, I want to talk about Magma Opus. This is one of the reasons I want X to equal 8. Because if we hit a Magma Opus in this big stack, I would love to cast it for free. But if I have it in my hand early, I don't mind discarding it to make an extra treasure token to ramp further. I'm talking about 7 lands to start this whole thing, but we need fewer of them if we've got some treasures on board. And we can even run some other classic spells like Frantic Search or Manamorphose. I'd love to hit a Frantic Search in one of these stacks, pitch a couple of lands, draw some cards, get 3 mana back for the future Epic Experiment. Even a Manamorphose is a profit of mana if we're not spending anything to cast it, and another draw. Since we do want to generate mana while we're doing our shenanigans, oh so many shenanigans, I'm making special room for a couple of key permanents. Bergi, the god of storytelling, will pay us back in a red mana for every one of our spells we cast. And we are casting them. It counts. Now that's only red mana, but Stormkiln Artist also pays us back in treasures every time we cast a spell. And if we get a Stormkiln Artist on the battlefield first, I'd consider casting Bergi on the back as a Harnfell Horn of Bounty. That's another thing to do with all those basics in our hand. Pitch him to keep digging for other parts of the combo. And if you haven't figured it out already, we're gonna do something with Storm. In particular, Storm cards that create creature tokens. Hunting Pack is a pricey one, not that it matters for Epic Experiment. It'll give us 4/4 green beasts. We've got Empty the Warrens to get a pair of goblins for each storm count, and most recently Chatterstorm. They're just 1/1 little squirrels, but there's a real possibility we're going to pull this back out of our graveyard and only cast it for another 2. Here's the thing about storm spells when you're stacking them on an Epic Experiment. You want them to resolve last. They count all the spells that were cast before it resolves. If you resolve it too early, there won't be a lot of spells cast. So storm spells go on the bottom. As a cousin of Mana Severance, I would consider Sprouting Vines. I am happy to hit this in the middle of a stack. If it's in the first batch of 8, maybe I'm pulling 3 or 4 lands out of the deck, which is fine. But if I hit it in the bottom one of the 3, it's kind of another functional Mana Severance. Except the big difference is these lands go into your hand. In these first 3 batches of Epic Experiments, where X equals 8, we can't guarantee we're going to get quite enough creature tokens to just win the game outright. So maybe we'll put something like a Haze of Rage in there, which will also storm off and give the whole team, I don't know, +12, +0. But the really exciting move is once we get Epic Experiment back from the graveyard and do it again. At this point, our storm count will be through the roof. And if we've burned all of our storm cards that make creatures, well, maybe that's another thing worth bringing back from the graveyard. My Chatterstorm's looking pretty good at 2 mana now, but we gotta have some sort of way to give everyone haste. I'd hate to wait a turn and have someone rat this board. Another reason to pick 8 is you get to run Insurrection. Not only does it give you the whole board's worth of creatures so that there's no blockers, but it gives all of your newly created tokens haste. And spreading Insurrection at this point is kind of the same thing. Our storm count won't be high enough to take a whole board worth of tokens, but I bet you we can take most of what's left. All the good stuff anyway. Burst of Speed's a fun sorcery to give the whole team haste, but the timing has to be right. We've got to be able to cast it after all those creatures show up. But then there's something like Anger, the perfect card to pitch into the graveyard to one of those big score type of effects. And remember, anything that's not an instant or sorcery ends up in the graveyard after we resolve our epic experiments. If Anger shows up in one of those stacks, no problem, it's going right to the graveyard. I've already talked about a fair amount of draw spells, but we gotta get epic experiment. So we're hoping to draw into it or one of our tutors. Solve the Equation is a recently printed card that doesn't cost too much yet. Obviously the first target is epic experiment, but if we find it while we're resolving an epic experiment, let's just find the next thing we need to finish the combo. Is it a storm spell? Is it something to pump the team? Something to get something back from the graveyard? Mystical Tutor's cool too if you want to cough up 20 bucks because again, it helps us get our epic experiment. But the key here is it puts something on top of the library. If Mystical Tutor shows up in a stack of epic experiment, you want to put it as low down on the stack as possible just before any storm cards. Definitely after anything that searches your library and makes you shuffle because you want to put the card on the top of the library so you can predict what'll be there for the next batch of epic experiments. It's a great way to guarantee one card in the next batch, if there's another batch coming. Ooh, and there better be. Another interesting way to find epic experiment is Muddle the Mixture. It's a 2-mana counter spell that only counters instants or sorceries, but we get to transmute it for 1 blue. Since epic experiment's mana value is 2, that's what we get with this. But we gotta be really careful with counter spells. They don't do a lot on the stack. We certainly don't want to counter our epic experiments, but we can use them to increase our storm count. First of all, we don't even have to cast it. But if we've got another one of those single G look for a basic land cards, it might be reasonable to actually counter that. We'll get credit for 2 spells between them resolving, even though only one of them actually resolved. The counter spell. This is obviously a fairly fragile glass cannon type of move. My favorite type of move, honestly. We'll need a bit of protection. I think it's worth making room for a Conqueror's Flail. Ensuring that no one can bother us with pesky spells during our turn is crucial. And Dominaria United has given us maybe the perfect Untapped Lucea Kane card there ever was. Shore Up. Not only does it untap her for another ability, but it also gives her hexproof so we don't have to worry about removal on her. But how badly should we fear counter spells? If they try to counter an epic experiment, we'll still get the copies on the stack. They'd need to counter each copy or have something that counters everything on the stack. I mean, if they have something that only lets us cast 1 spell per turn, you might as well scoop. This deck is only for tables of people who like fun. I've talked about going the storm route with a whole bunch of creatures and giving them all haste. After you loop epic experiment from the graveyard once, and your deck basically has no more lands in it. But there's a few other ways to go. You could hide a bunch of extra turn spells in the deck and just kind of land into those. That way you don't need to worry about giving your storm creatures haste. Just attack with them on the next turn. But I don't think we need to go that route. Another way to go is Aetherflux Reservoir. Then we can scrap all this business about creatures altogether. Since we're getting credit for casting these spells, we're gonna get our life total through the stratosphere. 50ing everybody will be no problem. And there's one more permanent I want to bring up. Astral Cornucopia. If we use Lucea's ability to cast this, we will get a copy of it. I think it's worth considering. We do want to hit a bunch of extra mana at some point, and this could provide a lot. Obviously, depending how you go, you might make room for a Blue Sun Zenith in there. And speaking of recursion, a Reap the Past, copied a couple times with Lucea will probably put the whole graveyard back in our hand. Or even a Wildest Dreams for X=2, copied a couple times for all of our key pieces to get it going again. Maybe. The other thing I should mention, if we pull off our second epic experiment, now we're copying it 3 or 4 times and X=15, those cards don't end up in the bottom of the library. They're going in the graveyard one way or another. Either we cast them or they pop into exile and go straight there. And we do have a few spells in here that are cantrippy types that just say draw a card. So we should probably avoid running those if we think we're going to epic experiment our whole deck. I mean, you hit one Cerulean Wisps in there and it's game over. Maybe there's room for a Laboratory Maniac in here. But this is the beauty of this kind of deck. Epic experiment. I don't think there's another card that exemplifies what an Izzet spell is all about. I know we're a teamer deck though, that was for the ramp. I love the idea of taking a massive swing, possibly drawing my whole deck, and maybe we don't win in the end. That's the thing about experiments. They don't always yield the results you want. They're fun to do. Please make sure everyone else at the table's having some fun too. Don't break this deck out at a table without trying it out a few times goldfish style. Learn how to stack the spells in the epic experiments. Have an idea what you're going to tutor for if you hit one of those on the stack. Just try to keep your turn to under 10 minutes. Under 5. 3 might be pushing it to actually just explain everything that's going on. Ooh, I friggin' love this deck. Let me know if you'd do something a little differently in the comments. In the meantime, you keep being you. The world's a better place for it. See you next time.